The refrigerated morgue unit was a sterile, humming box of metal and sorrow. Inside, on a steel gurney, lay the body of Omar, wrapped in a simple white shroud. For 3 weeks, his family had lived in a state of agonized suspension, caught between hope and the gnawing certainty of loss. Now he was back. The drive home was silent. The small white truck, usually used for carrying vegetables, now carried something far more precious and infinitely heavier. Omar's younger brother called, stared out the window, the ruins of Gaza a blur of concrete dust and skeletal buildings. He imagined he could see faces in the rubble, but he told himself it was just a trick of the light. They laid him on the floor of their living room, the one room that still had a relatively intact ceiling. Neighbors and relatives came, their whispers filling the space like smoke. They prayed, they wept, they remembered the man Omar had been, the one who could fix anything with his hands and whose laughter was loud enough to scare away the shadows. As night fell, the house grew quiet. Khaled lay on a thin mattress, sleep a distant country. Around 3 in the morning, he heard it. A soft scraping sound. Not the shifting of the house, not the distant rumble of machinery. It was closer. It came from the living room. He sat up, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The sound stopped. He waited, listening to the silence, convincing himself he was dreaming, that grief was playing tricks on his tired mind. He lay back down, squeezing his eyes shut. Then he heard it again. A dry, rustling noise, like linen being dragged across a concrete floor. He crept to the doorway of the living room. The moon, a sliver of bone in the black sky, cast a pale glow through the shattered window. And in that light he saw it. The white shroud was no longer neatly wrapped around Omar's body. It was partially unraveled, one corner dragged a foot away from the gurney. The scraping noise was the sound of the rough fabric against the floor. Khaled froze, a scream dying in his throat. It wasn't possible. The body was cold. He had touched his brother's hand, and it had been like stone. He backed away silently, returning to his mattress and pulling the blanket over his head, not for warmth, but to hide. He did not sleep again. The next day, the preparations for the funeral were grim. Khaled tried to tell his mother what he had heard, but the words caught in his throat. How could he say such a thing? It was madness. He would only deepen their pain. As they lifted Omar's body to take him for burial, Khaled saw the shroud was even more disheveled. He noticed something else too, a dark, damp stain on the concrete floor where the shroud had been dragged. It looked like old blood, but it was too dark, almost black. They buried him in the crowded cemetery, a new mound of earth joining 1,000 others. Khaled felt a profound sense of relief. It was over. Omar was at peace. That night, the silence in the house was heavier than before. The absence of Omar's body was a physical void. Khaled finally slept, a deep, exhausted slumber. He was woken not by a sound, but by a cold, a deep, unnatural cold that seeped into his bones. He opened his eyes. His breath plumed in the air. Frost, delicate and feathery, was creeping up the inside of the window pane. He sat up, his teeth chattering. The cold seemed to emanate from the corner of the room where Omar had lain. He stared into the darkness of that corner, and slowly, his eyes adjusting, he began to see something. It was not a solid shape, but a shimmering, a distortion in the air like heat haze on a summer road, but this was cold. So cold. The shimmering grew, coalescing, taking on a tall, gaunt form. It was the shape of a man, but it was made of shadow and shimmering air. It had no face, only a deeper patch of darkness where a face should be. Khaled scrambled back until his shoulders hit the wall. He couldn't breathe. The cold was a physical weight on his chest. The figure of shadow and cold did not move. It just stood there, a silent monument to something that should not be. It was a presence filled with a hunger that was not for food, but for warmth, for life, for the peace it had been denied. Then from the corner of the room came a soft sound, the dry, scraping sound of a shroud being dragged across a floor that was no longer there. Khaled finally screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. His mother rushed in, turning on the dim battery-powered lamp. The light flickered, then steadied, illuminating the empty corner. The cold was gone. The frost on the window was already melting, leaving streaks of dirty water. But Khald could still feel it. The presence, the hunger. He knew it was not over. It had just begun. The next day, Khald went to the cemetery. He stood before his brother's fresh grave, the earth already looking old and sad. He didn't know what he was looking for. An explanation. Absolution. He saw it then. A small patch of the disturbed earth near the headstone was dark, as if soaked with water. He knelt. The smell was faint but unmistakable. It was the same smell from the stain on their floor. The smell of the grave, of damp soil and something else. Something metallic and ancient. The smell of blood that was no longer quite human. He looked at the other graves, the hundreds of other mounds of earth. And he wondered how many of them were stirring in their sleep. How many families had heard a scraping sound in the night. The ceasefire had brought back the bodies, but it had also brought back something else. A curse, a hunger, an army of the wrong dead, returning not to be mourned, but to reclaim the warmth they had lost, one cold house at a time. And as Khald looked out over the sea of graves, he knew they were all coming home.